Okay, so the next topic that we should consider in our exploration of the different hand features and what they indicate is the fingers. So, as we discussed before, when you're looking at hand shapes, you're looking at the shape of the palm in relationship to the proportional length of the fingers. And in those hands where the palm is dominant, such as the earth hand or the fire hand, so you've got a square palm in the earth hand, rectangular palm in the fire hand, but the fingers are both short. In both cases, they're short in relationship to the palm. And that's a very interesting thing, because one of the easiest way to understand is the relationship between the fingers and the palm is it's an analog to the relationship between the mind and the body. So if you take the elements earth and fire, earth is very much about the physical body and physical activity, and fire is also someone who really likes to do things. So the element of fire is always very active. So both earth and fire are very obvious and evident and outwardly directed into the material world. Whereas air and water, those hand shapes have much longer fingers. And in those hand shapes, what that tells us is that the energy is much more in the mind, much more internal. So with water, you've got the internal realm of feeling, and with air, you've got the internal realm of ideas. So this is a really easy way to understand the relationship between the fingers and the palm, is the relationship between the mind and the body. So someone with really long fingers is much more mentally preoccupied. Somebody with a much more broad, wide, strong palm is much more physically enacted in the world. So that's the general indication of the provenance of the fingers. They are to do with the mind, and that can be understood in a number of different ways. So the first thing that can be understood is the fingers show something of our mental interests. So when you're looking at the details of the fingers, you can see things like whether someone's interested in religion or interested in learning languages, or whether they're interested in art or beauty or cooking or gardening or collecting antiques. There are different features in the fingers that show our mental preoccupations and interests. So that's one of the things that the fingers show. It shows something of our mental understanding and orientation. So, for example, really long-fingered people are very interested in detail, and knotty-fingered people are very thorough and analytical, and short-fingered people are more impulsive, and smooth-fingered people are more intuitive. So there are different kind of correlations which have been made with mental activity and the quality of the fingers as they present themselves. But a far more interesting thing, much more interesting layer to the fingers, is their psychological significance. So if we think of air elements in terms of psychology, the way that someone's minds work in a psychological sense, then what we can see in the fingers is a great deal about the psychological motivations of a person. So one of the ways I think is really useful to look at the fingers is in terms of different identities. So if you're looking at the index finger, the index finger is seen to be a measure of our self-identity. It's how we feel about ourselves, how we have confidence in ourselves. The middle finger, I like to think of as our cultural identity, like how do we relate to the culture in which we're born, and how do we relate to the rules of the society in which we live. The ring finger is our social identity. It's how we are with other people, how we interact with other people. And it's also to do with our creativity and our expression, whether that's artistic or just to do with personal aesthetic and clothing. And the little finger is the air element finger, and the air finger is to do with communication, which means speaking literally and talking, but also it's related to the field of sexuality, which is, of course, kind of the most intimate and complete communication you can have with another human being, really. So that's the general provinces of these 4 digits. The index finger is ruled by the water element, to do with self-identity. The middle finger is ruled by the earth element, to do with your relationship to culture, so your cultural identity. The ring finger is to do with expression and sociability, so that's your social identity. And your little finger is well by air, and that's to do with your communicative identity. And I'll just pull up some illustration of these different types of formations of these fingers, so we can actually have a look at some of these things here. So I will just share the screen. There we go, share screen. All right, so I've just got a collection of a few different handprints which you might find interesting to consider. So that's a kind of fairly normal, balanced arrangement of the fingers. So you can see that the middle finger, the earth finger, is the longest finger. The water finger and the fire finger are about the same length, sitting either side of the earth finger. And the little finger, if you look at it carefully, you can see that it comes up to the crease at the top, between the top two phalanges on the ring finger. So that's the normal length for the air finger to be there. The ring finger and the index finger, the water and fire fingers, should be about the same length, and should be about halfway up the middle finger. So, but clearly not everybody's hand looks the same, and not everybody's finger arrangements are the same, and that's when we've got to start noticing the difference between them. Once we have an idea of how the fingers normally present themselves, then we can look out for differences in that. So one obvious example that we can see here is how the fingers on this hand are all leaning towards the thumb side. This is a classic case of what we call leaning fingers. It's not just that the fingers are bent, but they are actually all rotated towards the thumb side of the hand. They're not sitting straight on the hand at all. And this is a very significant patterning of behavior that comes from this particular alignment of the fingers. Unfortunately, it's incredibly common amongst young people these days. It's kind of a reflection of the fact they spend too much time on social media. But there's an interesting causative factor behind that to do with their personal psychology. Sometimes fingers are very widely spread, as you can see in this hand here, and the finger spacings are all indicative. And as you can see, the ring finger and the middle finger, the fire and earth finger, are quite close together, and they're quite well balanced. But it's the little finger and the index finger that are sort of sticking out, and that's an important display of fingers to take note of. What are the different spaces between the two fingers? Typically, the ring finger and the middle finger will always be relatively close to each other, so that's unusual to see them wide apart. But when we're looking at the other fingers, if you can notice, the gap is more than twice as wide between the little finger and the ring finger, and the ring finger and the earth finger, then you've got a very significant deviation from the norm. And obviously that accentuates the qualities of the little finger, and in this case also accentuates the qualities of the index finger as well. They're being thrust into the limelight and being much more prominent. In this hand, you can see the fingers are generally located close to each other. So that's a kind of that's a closely aligned fingers. They're all relatively well spaced with each other. You can see there's a little bit more space between the water finger and the earth finger again, and the air finger and the fire finger, and the fire and earth all close together, like we saw before. In this case, here we have a hand where the fingers are lying fairly straight on the hand, but the index finger is really protruding out towards the thumb side of the hand. Usually this is an indication of somebody who's very attention-seeking and very needy of attention. It's kind of like a sort of self-prominancing characteristic when you see a hand like this. Remember, the index finger is to do with self-identity. So it's prominancing oneself in some kind of way. And in this case, you can see that the water finger is longer than the ring finger. So remember, these two should be about the same length, and here they are. It's a much longer finger than the ring finger. On this hand, you've actually got the middle finger bending towards the ring finger. You can see, if you look carefully at that, the top finger there, top of the phalange there, is bending to the left as we're looking at it, bending towards the ring finger. So these kind of bends are significant as well. So we need to look at the proportional length of fingers. So going back to that water finger, we can see that that water finger is more prominent because it's bigger than the ring finger. And also in this hand, we can see that the middle finger is bent, and that's also significant too. Okay, this person has had an accident, so this is not significant. So it looks like a short middle finger, but they actually had an accident, had the top of the finger cut off. So that's not something that we should take into consideration in terms of the length. So just because the middle finger is short doesn't necessarily mean it has a particular psychological characteristic other than carelessness with machinery, shall we say. In this handprint, in this hand, you can see that the ring finger is longer than the index finger. So that's a completely different set of characteristics. Again, it's actually a very important balance to look at the proportional length of the water finger and the fire finger. So ideally, they should be balanced around the earth finger. But sometimes the ring finger is longer than the water finger. Sometimes the water finger is longer than the ring finger. So, and you need to notice which way around it is. And if it's present like that, it shows you two different types of people. Essentially, what you can think of it is the water finger being prominent makes somebody more concerned with their inner world. So they're more introverted and more concerned with how they feel. And where someone with a long ring finger is more extroverted, they're more socially orientated and more concerned with their being a participant in a group setting or being at a party or in the company of other people. So that's kind of a very general kind of distinction between those two. But if you think about the elements, that says something about this reflection of how the elements themselves operate. Water is internally directed. Fire is externally directed. Fire is all about going out and radiating that energy and heat outwards. Water kind of draws everything into itself. It's very absorbing. Oh, and here's somebody else who's been careless with machinery. This is a woman who's had an accident with a bandsaw when she was a child. So again, we've got this is an amputation or an accident, not a significant chirological feature, shall we say. And here's another example of the ring finger being longer than the index finger. This is a good way of looking at the hands. If you're going to try and measure the relative length of the fingers, it's good to get the hand straight, get the hand facing upwards, and get the fingers close to each other like that, so you can measure the distance between them. The difference between them there is probably about 3 or 4 millimeters. That doesn't sound a lot. Doesn't look a lot of huge difference, but it's actually a significant difference to have just a couple of millimeters difference in terms of the personal psychology of that person and the effects it has on them. So that's important to consider. Even if it looks like a minor difference, it's worth noting. In this case, you've got a ring finger that's bent. You can, if you look at it carefully, you can see that the ring finger is a banana shape there, bending towards the middle finger. This is one of the interesting effects of childhood experiences. I like to think of the bent ring finger as a product of adverse childhood experiences. It certainly shows that the person has difficulty enjoying themselves or having fun and doing things that are what would otherwise be considered fun and playful. So there's an issue around that, but it's usually brought about by some kind of issue in their upbringing, which is worth exploring. And I've just noticed on this hand, if you look carefully here, you can actually see that the little finger, the air finger, has got an extra phalangeal crease. I hadn't mentioned the creases before, but I guess I should draw attention. Now we've got something drawing our attention to it. You'll notice that each of the fingers has 3 sections. Each of these are called phalanges, and these creases between the phalanges form along the line of the knuckles, and you always get one line on the top, and you get 2 lines on the bottom knuckle. And then sometimes you find that these so-called crease lines, interphalangeal creases, is how they often refer to. Sometimes they can actually be missing, or as in this case, sometimes an extra one can be present. And what's particularly interesting about this interphalangeal crease is because it doesn't correlate with any joint or movement in the finger. It's not like there's an extra bone. It's not like this finger's got 4 bones instead of 3. It's got the usual 3, but it's got an extra crease line. And this is actually one of the arguments that shows that really even the lines between the finger phalanges, which most easily correlate and readily correlate, can be seen to correlate with the folding action of the fingers. So each of those lines occur where there's a joint in the finger itself. So they appear, therefore, that they are actually formed by that folding action. And so, therefore, that is one of the arguments why scientists will say, oh, they're just crease lines caused by folding. But here's a good example of how a line like that is formed in the palm, but actually isn't a crease line because there's no folding action there that could cause that crease. So the bare presence of this extra lineation on this phalange of the air finger is actually evidence that the lines themselves are not formed by folding. So, and what's interesting about that is the scientific dermatoglyphic literature is actually full of examples where they talk about extraphalangeal creases or missing interphalangeal creases, particularly, for example, in the case of Down syndrome. And yet the logic of that observation has escaped their attention because they still always refer to the lines as creases or lines as folds in the skin. But actually, the presence of an extra interphalangeal crease, such as this example here, conclusively proves that these lines are not caused by folding, because that line has appeared where there is no fold in the finger. So there you go. That's something extra, an extra thing to think about. Not quite sure I've got that what's going on in that handprint. I'll move on to the next one. I know we've got too many double loops. That's what it is. That's what that handprint's about. All right. I'll just jump the order there a little bit. Okay, so in this hand, you can see someone who's got a bent earth finger. Is that what we're looking at there? No, what we're looking at here is a low set air finger. All right, so now we're looking at the air finger. There's quite a lot of variations in the air finger. The air finger's probably got the more variations of all the fingers. As I mentioned before, the air finger should reach up to this crease here, and you can see with this hand here that that air finger is not actually reaching to that point there. And if you look at the base of the finger, you can see that actually the fingers dropped down into the palm, and that's called a low set air finger. And what the effect of that has is it makes the finger look short. And a short air finger is problematic in terms of communication, but a low set air finger is problematic in terms of sexual expression. The person who first uncovered that notion was actually Julius Speer in his book, The Hands of Children, published in 1944. So if you want to look at something, the psychosexual development from a neurological point of view, that's a really good book to start with. And here again is another low set air finger, and you can see quite clearly how short that one is there. And then this air finger is very bent. The observant amongst you will notice this woman also has very leaning fingers as well. And you can see all these fingers are kind of pushing over to the thumb side in both her hands. And as you can tell from the number of lines in the hand, this is a very anxious and nervous young woman. But the severe bending in the air finger is again an indication that there's something wrong with her communicative identity, and that's where that's the clues as to what you need to investigate when you see a finger like that. Something going on in her capacity to communicate in some kind of way. Oh, and on the other hand, here is someone with a long air finger. So you can see that's where the finger should come to. It should come to this crease here, and it extends above that. This person has the opposite problem with communication. This is someone who talks rather a lot. And it's been an interesting observation of mine as I've been touring around New Zealand, which is not a country known for its intellectual orientation. The number of people with long air fingers I've encountered who are hairdressers. In other words, people who are in a line of work that requires a lot of talking. And anyone with a long air finger will excel and be very enthusiastic about any job where they get to talk a lot and get paid for it. As does this woman, who was, I remember reading this hand, she was a real estate agent. So again, you've got somebody with a very strong gift of the gab. Anybody in sales will do well if they've got a long finger of communication. So that's a very good indication of that too. Oh, and on the other hand, here is a very, very, very small and very low set air finger as well. This finger looks really stunted. As you can see, obviously it's an older woman, but this finger being so short and low set is probably one of the most extreme versions of this finger I've seen. But you're going to be exploring issues about not just about communication particularly, but more about sex and sexuality and relationship issues. When someone's got a short little low set air finger like that, that's what that is going to be indicating. Remember, like, the longer the finger, the stronger the quality. The shorter the finger, the weaker the quality. And usually when it's low set like this, it shows that the problem has arisen through some kind of issue during childhood. So that's one of the fascinating things I think about the fingers in the hands, is that they actually relate a lot to our childhood developmental experiences as well. So what we've got in the fingers, as I said, the fingers are to do with the psychological factors of somebody's mind. But when we're considering it from that sort of point of view, looking at developmentally, then the relative strength or weakness of the fingers will point to various childhood experiences that have affected or encouraged, positively or negatively affected our psychological development, whether we're self-confident, whether we have guilt complexes, whether we are shy and insecure, whether we are able to articulate our needs, whether we are arrogant and egotistical or very sensitive to criticism, or whether we're very conservative or very much had a very strict upbringing and had a lot of fear in our childhood, whether we were sexually abused in our childhood, whether we were neglected by our parents in some kind of way. All these kind of experiences have a profound effect upon us psychologically. And one of the ways that it shows up is it's shown up by the way that the fingers grow during our childhood and adolescence. Clearly, once we've become an adult, our fingers won't change again. But I think of it like the hand growing and like the fingers growing like a plant. And if they are watered well, they'll grow strong and they'll grow straight, and they will, the qualities associated with that finger will blossom. You know, so if your parents loved you, you will feel self-confident. If communication and sharing knowledge and information is encouraged in your family, your air finger will be strong. If respect and respect for order and convention is a powerful feature in your childhood, then your middle finger will be strong, and the opposite if it's short, and so on and so forth. So the strength of the fingers and the strength of the four identities will be a function of how those identities were nourished during your childhood experiences. So the fingers are kind of incredibly important for understanding childhood psychosexual development issues and the psychological effects of our upbringing, this impact of our family and the parents upon the people that we become as adults. And so that's why it's really important to look at the fingers, the length of the finger, the spacings of the fingers, the bends of the fingers, the leans of the fingers, and the shortness of the fingers, or the setting of the fingers. These are all factors that need to be taken into consideration when you're assessing the fingers from a psychological point of view. Most of the time you read palmistry books, they talk about the flexibility and the knots and the tip shapes, and they look at it from a sort of intellectual, mental point of view. I don't think those are really that interesting. And big store again is made by people like Benham again to do that. For example, he assesses fingertips and finds that they're an incredibly important way of assessing and the personality of a person, because it says something about the way that their minds work, according to him. But actually, most people have round conic fingertips, and it's very rare that you see properly spatulate or pointy fingertips, let alone square fingertips. In my experience, I did actually see some pointy fingertips last weekend in Hamilton. That was probably the first time I've seen pointy fingertips like that in 20 years. So they're very rare, and so their value is very limited because there's just not much variation that goes on in those experiences. So other things are far more significant and far more important in the fingers, and the psychological impacts of childhood as it's reflected in the fingers, I think, is an incredibly revealing part of the hand. So the fingers are very fascinating, and they furnish a lot of information. That's just a brief summary of the finger elemental rulership of the fingers and the kind of provenances that they show. The next thing to consider when it comes to the fingers is the fingerprints, and that will be the subject for our next little discourse. So if you've been enjoying this series so far, don't forget to subscribe so you can get all the latest updates when they come through. And do put your comments below, and I will answer any questions that you may have. And enjoy looking at people's hands. All right. See you soon.